Welcome back to Builders of the Broken Bazaar. I'm your host again, Dr. Tabish Zaman. Now, today, let me start with something which is very important in entrepreneurship, but we don't usually question when we talk about the word finance. Now, I'm going to take you to Canada today. In Canada, impact investing assets now exceed up to $30 billion. And again, bringing it back to Europe, sustainable finance, it has crossed almost 1 trillion euros. So what does it tell us? It tells us that capital is moving, markets are very active, but the language of inclusion, which again is everywhere, but here's where the story actually begins to fracture. Because capital may be growing, but access to it is not. And again, going back to Canada, refugees, they continue to face high unemployment. Here in Europe, highly skilled migrants, they remain locked out of roles they're very qualified for. So I'll tell you this, inclusion is being funded, but it's not being delivered. So something doesn't quite add up, because if capital exists and opportunities are out there, why does access still feels conditional? Why do people with capability remain locked out of the system that claim to be open? And more importantly, who decides what is considered investable and what is ignored? Because the moment you follow that question, this stops becoming about entrepreneurship. And I know a thing or two about entrepreneurship. And it all becomes about the structure, about design, about power. And to understand that properly, you need to see both sides of that equation. Not just how capital is structured, but what entrepreneurship actually looks like on the ground. And my guest today works at the intersection of capital, system, and access. Firstly, Bradford Turner is a Canadian social entrepreneur, investment strategist, and management consultant. But more importantly, he's someone who spent over 2 decades understanding how money actually moves and who it leaves behind. Across his career, he has helped build, mobilize, and deploy over $200 million in public and private funding, working across organizations like Engineers Without Borders, Save the Children, and now Jumpstart Refugee Talent. But what makes his work different is not just the scale, his focus. Because Bradford is not just moving capital, he's questioning how capital is structured, who it recognizes, and who it systematically overlooks. As a co-founder and managing director of the sector, and now leading the Refugee Impact Fund at Jumpstart, his work is centered on building something most systems still don't have: a functioning pathway between overlooked entrepreneurs and institutional capital, not as a charity, not as a short-term support, but as infrastructure. But systems, they don't exist in isolation. They are shaped and often exposed by what happens in practice. And that's where my second guest comes in. Waseem Jawad works directly with refugee entrepreneurs through Jumpstart, supporting them as they build, navigate, and often struggle within systems that don't always move with them. Again, Waseem's work sits at the point where ideas actually meets friction and where limits of a system become most visible. And bringing these two perspectives together, the reality of entrepreneurship and the architecture of capital, allows us to ask a much more honest question. So Bradford and Waseem, thrilled to have you both on Builders of the Broken Bazaar.
Thank you, Tabish. Absolutely thrilled to be with you today and to engage in this timely, important, and hopefully to your viewers, incredibly meaningful dialogue. Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much, Brad. So I want to start with you. And again, before everything we discuss, there's so many questions. Now, before we get into the institution, before we get into the capital, before the systems which you now work within, you have described your greatest achievement not as financial milestone, but overcoming something, which again, if you're comfortable talking about, homelessness. And I think that's important to sit with here, amongst 3 of us, because that's not a personal story. That's a structural position within the system itself. It shapes how experiences, access, and opportunity, even the idea of what is possible. So when you look back at that period now, I want to know, and audience wants to know, how did it shape the way you understand economic systems, not just in theory, but in how they actually include or exclude people?
Well, first and foremost, Tabish, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak on such a formative experience for me. And first, allow me to highlight how ironically grateful I am for that experience. Life is not one size fits all, nor is it a linear path. And my experience as a young man in and out of homelessness and other forms of economic and sociocultural inclusivity has left me with an orientation towards my fellow humanity that I think created a vector that would shape the entire arc of my career and my life from that point on. The one thing I truly took away from it, and you learn it quickly, is that exclusivity does not discriminate. That as soon as you no longer fit an archetype that is of value to the economic system in which decides whether or not you have a role to play in that overall economic utility, you are quickly disenfranchised, be it access to capital, access to education, access to social cohesion, access to basic standards of living. In my experiences in a developed economies such as Canada, it was incredibly impactful for me. And I think I don't normally speak about this publicly, but I'm thrilled to do so. And given the opportunity, the one area that stuck with me over my own personal struggles was also my inherent privilege. And I was born into what we would socioeconomically class as an upper to middle class family in the Canadian social strata. And early on in my childhood, before the deconstruction of my family and the eventual homelessness that ensued, I did grow up in a household that stressed university, that stressed economic and social inclusivity, and taught norms of certain interactions and institutions that one would naturally participate as they matured into, quote unquote, and I say this tongue in cheek, a productive member of Canadian society at that time. So it was very interesting. And there's one story I often tell where I was sleeping outside of the London, Ontario Aquatic Centre with no roof in a sleeping bag. And somebody who had actually taught me in high school saw me there and stopped by and had a conversation with me. And it kind of went along the paraphrase narrative of son, why are you out here? And you know, what are you doing? And what do you expect to happen in your life? And I remember answering very matter of fact, this is something that has happened to me. This is my plan to navigate my way out of it. And eventually I'll do an MBA at one of the top schools in Canada. It turned out to be the United Kingdom where I did that education at the end of I want to stress that those seeds were planted in me and they were there to be harvested eventually when the soil warmed to the point where that garden came to fruition. And I never forgot that because I came across so many others that didn't have that early point of privilege, that didn't have that early point of inclusivity, that didn't have those lessons ingrained, that no matter what was happening to them into the short term, that in the long term, that our country held provisions economically, educationally, socially, for anybody to be able to be what they wanted to be, do what they wanted to do, as long as they adhere to certain values. And I found that, unfortunately, that isn't so, and has become less and less so in terms of the overall inclusivity of the Canadian economy as well as social mobility. So it's ironic that it was the best thing that ever could have happened to me in those formative years of my life. And they truly allowed me to see that somebody that is resilient and is going to persevere deserves a chance in the later form of life. They deserve investment, they deserve consideration, they deserve humanity, and that a system that would prevent them from participating is inequitable and needs to be changed.
Look, that is brilliantly defined, Brad, but what this podcast stands for and what we're talking about, and your perspective is so unique there in terms of talking about ideas, talking about merit, opportunity, and fairness. So do you think that point when you are navigating so many things and, in terms of your own experiences, did it change the way how you think about these things in terms of how you look at how fair things are, how many opportunities are coming your way or not coming your way? And again, talking about merit, because clearly where you stand today is a culmination of all of them.
Not only did it change the way I thought about things in my ability to navigate in that environment, but later on it showed me that unfortunately the system is geared to completely exclude those who do not conform to those norms at an early age and then, successively reaffirm them, prove those norms through the various kind of rites of passage as they mature through the economic and linear path that was put forth before them. When you experience something like displacement, like childhood trauma, homelessness, things of this nature, it rewires your brain. It changes your physiology. You exhibit behaviors and symptoms of a survivalist nature. or of a sociocultural differentiation that historically the Canadian economy has almost been socially engineered to reject. And that carries you throughout your whole life. So if that can happen to, again, a third generation Canadian who was born into middle class strata of London, Ontario, think of the social determinants of exclusion towards a displaced individual who's never stepped foot on Canadian soil or had the benefit of any kind of pedigree that allowed me to navigate my path.
And this is where I bring Waseem into the conversation as well. Waseem, again, you're working with individuals who are entering those systems from position of constraint, often without any starting point. Again, give us your perspective on how it has been in terms of working with people who experience, again, access in a very different way or lack of it in a way, and then they're trying to build something. What has been your experience?
Thank you for having me. To be honest, part of my journey, my personal journey, this is where when I came and joined Jumpstart, I lived that journey. As a refugee, came here to Canada in 2017. I was seeking to help to understand the market here, and I came with the engineering background with very successful career track back there and entrepreneurship track as well in the Middle East. But when I came here, I had the potential and the opportunity actually to come and pitch my idea and startup in AI with the problem that I was facing here in Canada of how to recycle here. And I thought that it's a problem for a newcomer or refugee here. And so I saw a problem. I found a solution with AI to support with recycling. And it's back then in 2019 or 18, it was the new trend there, the AI. And I was fortunate to know Jumpstart, who helped me to come and pitch my idea to some of angel investors. I acknowledge that I was open to the feedback they're getting from the angel investors about my knowledge and pitch skill, all of these aspects and challenges that I have to. That was the first time I came before any partners, potential partners, potential funders. It is a really different system back there. The financing and the funding process is totally different from North America. So I acknowledge that, and I went back to school. I took my master in innovation entrepreneurship management at Queen's, also the top school here in Canada. And there I acknowledge that I need to understand the market to see my weak points and to build on that. So I have that privilege to then ask by Jumpstart founders to come and join them to support my peers. And this is what the greatest thing that I start working on. So back to your questions, I'm sorry for that intro, but it's good that understanding those challenges and give my clients, let's say, or refugees there, how to see those challenges in a way that, okay, how to build on those and how to understand the feedback and what's approach and how that's different from their point of view with the current other standard system here in Canada, and where we can try to help in a way or other and how to break that down.
And again, this is where and the reason I asked both these questions to you in terms of your own experience, and again, the way you've looked at and what your work is at the moment, because I want to talk about participation in the system, and both of you expert in your own different areas that way within Jumpstart. I want to ask this question again, if you can take this, but do we understand or do we see how the system is designed, especially when you start from the point of exclusion and what it takes to participate in them, especially for those who start from that point, from the marginality?
Yeah, I think that ultimately Waseem is likely better equipped to really articulate this from Jumpstart's perspective. I think that I'm still kind of euphoric from having been invited to speak about my own personal experience. So from that, I'm going to stick on that. And certainly there are attributes that are discriminatory and exclusive to refugees as well as, any marginalized population in the Canadian economy and society at this point in time. It's easy to jump right into the technical aspect of our work. So to say that credit ratings, access to collateral, credentialism, the technical components and data that make up lendability, worthiness, an attractive financial history from an impact investing or debt-based product investment fund, our typical answer. But I think it starts so much earlier, unfortunately. While I don't mean to speak purely from an activist kind of perspective, you cannot ignore language and sociocultural barriers, be it appearance, be it dress, be it choices in terms of the relatability of habits as it comes to cultivating business relationships and acting and transacting in the sociocultural norms of Canada is something that has been ingrained over the last 100 years to be a very rigid, a very specific, and a very exclusive set of skills, signals, and symbolism that has been taught to a society who is going to participate in that echelon of the economic pie at large. And I think that, these are extreme points of exclusivity and need to be acknowledged when focusing on developing solutions towards refugee economic inclusion, but economic inclusion for any marginalized group. Waseem, any further thoughts?
From the, let's say, the refugee perspective, it's same, maybe the problems, but looking at it from the other side as well. It's that how to build the knowledge, how to find the accessing help, even though if it's before or what's you needed before getting access to the fund itself. So all of those kind of knowledge lifters and all of these kind of supporters, building the network, understanding the market, finding the similar stories and those customized services for each of those entrepreneurs, because each of them had their own journey, structure, business sector, and knowledge. So these kind of tailored services, which usually it's really hard to build or to find, and to find somebody also to understand this kind of barriers and challenges. Adding that to all the living or day-to-day challenges for those refugees that they need to feed their families, they're facing this discrimination in every way, wherever they are going, and finding job, survival job, though, educating their kids, all these kind of day-to-day challenges, in addition to understanding and going within the market and pitching their businesses and find the support.
So can we say, and again, in your own respective way, you've explained that very well, but can we say some of these things are part of the formal system? And again, we always assume that when someone enters that formal system or the formal structure, things automatically begin to align. But in practice, and again, you both are seeing that from the lived experience to the actual value, it's always not as straightforward, isn't it? It's not as aligned as we think, in terms of getting to know some of these terms, or getting to know some of these people in that circle, and again, entering that pathway. Now, in your own way, do you think your experience and now working with, a range of people in Canada, do you feel that disconnect in that formal, the clash of the formal and the lived experience? Because again, I strongly feel we don't talk enough about the lived experience, because those formal structures are in place. Most of my work actually looks at the institution and the role of institution, which are so well organized. The Western world is so well equipped to handle that. But there's a form for everything. There's a process for everything. There are people for everything. But then the lived experience, that clash, and that is what we are interested in trying to, and two are the best examples of how you could talk about because of your work.
I could start with you by putting that you're right. There is a standardized processes. Most of those kind of either programs or services have those kind of either criteria as standards that you need to follow, and to give also a fair, or let's say fair ground for every applicant, for every people to access, to be honest. But that in our cases would be against that. Those criteria will be really challenging. Maybe small points would be really hard for certain group or certain, let's say, refugees to meet and to access. And that will have all the consequences that happen to either access to these services or even challenges in other sectors that, okay, I was not able to apply here And that will prevent me for accessing different, let's say, or maybe getting the credentials that get me a problem with going with this certain program. So you're right. Maybe sometimes or the certain points will be really critical point for the whole journey there. And this is where we really need to have those kind of, I'm not saying that slow process, but really flexible one that go this kind of adaptation and understanding those needs.
I think again, when we look at it, especially in terms of people with potential, the experience they have, and again, talking about resilience, which is an important term, there is a disconnect in terms of how systems still struggle to recognize that in formal or institutional terms. But how does it affect people who position themselves as builders, as entrepreneurs? Because that gap exists between what should be recognized and what keeps coming up in terms of who they are, what they want to do. And this is where, Brad, I'll come to you in terms of taking you back to the sector, because again, it didn't sort of talking about the formal institution. It started very informally, as my research suggests. I don't know if I'm correct, but a conversation, a simple idea, saying something wasn't working. Now, at that moment, what was the problem you were trying to solve, which you felt existing institutions weren't looking enough or they weren't addressing enough?
Well, I mean, there's a number of key points to look at there, but when we look at it from a systems lens and we talk through the nomenclature of systems change, I think we often fail to really look at the point in time in which we're assessing the system or the resistance of the system to change, so to become more inclusive. I mean, if you look at Canada right now, the system isn't working for the majority of Canadians writ large. I mean, housing prices are completely out of control and unattainable for so many of the population. Access to vital social services and community spaces are becoming more and more scarce. Division in and amongst the population due to lack of cohesive norms, approaches to worship, approaches to community, approaches to communal events and culture are at a bit of an inflection point in this Canadian experiment right now. And economically, I'm pleased to say that while all of the barriers to that kind of critical mass of change, where we find the unapologetic march towards a more inclusive and prosperous Canada for the majority of Canadians that deserve to be, within that that middle class that has been such a strong backbone of the Canadian economy. We really have to also recognize that it's a bit of a point of urgency, if not a point of critical systems failure, where, well, I hate to say that, there is a beneficial outcome in that these underutilized segments of the potential for economic development can no longer be ignored. So when we look at the evolution of an impact investing market in Canada, I often look at the impact investing market as really kind of an activist phase of the galloping and changing behavior of the institutional actors that will eventually succumb to embodying the policies and the liberalized capital allocation that will result in the trickle down and the customized products from a sociocultural perspective to actually cover the diversity that we see in the Canadian population at this point in time. You'll note that later in the conversation, we'll be speaking about refugee lens investing and the approach that we're taking to launching our products and initiatives into the Canadian economy. And I want to be clear from my personal bias, I like to look at that as a finite experiment. I hope at some point there won't be piecemeal refugee impact funds that are trying to cause a difference and trying to prove that, in fact, these populations are resilient, they're investable, they deserve economic inclusion. And it takes this kind of an experiment in order to validate that in the eyes of the institutional allocators of capital. I want to see a world or a Canadian economy where those institutional allocators of capital view refugee lens investing as habitual, as proven, and it's one approach within the many that have been proven through the continual success of the Canadian impact investing ecosystem to show that the non-traditional communities should pass your credit checks, they should pass your due diligence systems, And we are at an inflection point in the Canadian economy that if we do not unlock their potential, their productivity, and the overall shaping of our future that they're going to help us build, then we simply are not going to have a system that works.
And I think you're very intentional about that, Brad, throughout your work, which at least I've come across in terms of all the research I've put in. Coming to you, Waseem, in terms of your side, again, do you see such solutions already emerging? Again, I'm aware of, at least in this part of the world, but give us a flavor in terms of what you see among entrepreneurs before they interact with the institution, before they go to the system, or at least get that recognition. Do you see solutions coming out on their own part, or do you see them working out something?
We're seeing a lot of, let's say, efforts and work from the research perspective and also social impact, let's say, ecosystem in general. There is acknowledgement about this problem. As Bradford mentioned, refugees here in Canada are well under, let's say, very critical circumstances here with also Canadian economy situation, that the whole ecosystem is looking to those kind of problems and how we can find those solutions. But to be honest, this from the financial perspective, those are not, let's say, well crafted and well built for those things. That there are a lot of efforts in the, let's say, educational things, in the programming and in the research part. There are a lot of let's say, targeted and tailored services for newcomers and refugees, for newcomers. For the financial perspective, this is where we are trying to solve here at Jumpstart and to build this kind of ecosystem.
I'm glad you mentioned Jumpstart, and this is where we get right into it in terms of talking about the system failure, but in terms of what you guys are seeing day in, day out. And again, not just from the outside, now from within, but right in the thick of the entire context. Tell us, where do people fall through more often? And what is it all about? Is it the complexity? And again, this is the learning for me. I'll be honest with you. I want to learn a bit about this. Is it the complexity? Is it lack of coordination? Or it comes down to accountability? Or there is something else altogether? Are we talking about agency?
I'll start from the refugee perspective, and I will leave it to Bradford from the system side or from the stakeholder side. From the refugee, mainly and maybe I covered some of those, the lack of knowledge about where to find those kind of support or how to apply and how to go with or to deal with this system, where to find help, how to do that, what's the first step, how to keep things going and to balance between your daily needs, critical situations, economic situation and pressure, and your entrepreneurship journey. And the other thing is that, again, based on that knowledge, also how to build their network. Network and newcomers in general, and especially refugees, come with really no saving, nothing to be able to invest in their in new life here in Canada. And there is no friends, no network that could depend on to start or to, so they fall on this cycle of whatever I'm getting saving, it will almost keep me putting food on the table here for my family. So it will be really difficult to keep going and to start that, the first steps. Whenever they are seeking this kind of either financial or networking help, they will hit with this kind of systematic challenges to apply or to get those kind of support and services.
Yeah, and Waseem is quite aptly correct in asking me to chime in on the systems perspective. The more one works with me, the more that they realize I unapologetically, but also extremely stubbornly that way. When I think of the Canadian system, and I really hone in on what you said of lack of agency, in impact investing, we look at place-based investing all the time. We look at a healthy community, a healthy region, the ability to have a circular economy, the unit of, be it family or, whatever kind of sociocultural unit is kind of the backbone of a certain kind of communal structure. Nonetheless, this is required in order to recycle capital for the equal distribution of that capital in a way that benefits and grows a country. And I think right now Canada is really suffering from the lack of place-based investing and the recycling of capital. And I think that this affects newcomers, refugees, marginalized communities more so than anybody. The pathways to the corporate or institutional economy have, become increasingly exclusive to those that, again, I touched on before, do not kind of carry those symbols, those language sets, those credentials, those rites of passage. Canadian work history, it is incredible, the obstacle and the barrier to just basic economic inclusion in that institutional economy that a lack of Canadian credential and work history can bring, no matter the experience and the preferred skill set that newcomer or refugee may bring to that competitive process in that nature. So in that sense, the system is very much broken, but continually breaking under the pressure of a consolidation in the corporate sector. So with everything pushing towards shareholder value and kind of the hollowing out of the traditional middle class, as well as small, medium enterprises being the backbone of these place-based communities, we're just not seeing people have access to livelihoods and access to gainful employment and other opportunities to entrepreneurships, local market, where culture is familiar, where transactions are standard, where capital is tailored towards those specific businesses and entrepreneurs. And that's largely what the Canadian impact investing ecosystem is structuring itself to change, hopefully, over the course of the experiment that we're in right now. So that would just give me a bit of a step back that in 2018, the federal government launched its Canadian social finance strategy, where they spent about $8 million into the market. And they capitalized both the supply side of the market so that the funds, the intermediaries, the foundations that were going to participate in allocating that capital into place-based and community investing. And then on the other side, they built the pipeline. So they provided grants and catalytic capital to organizations such as Jumpstart Refugee Talent that was able to stand up place-based or impact-specific funds and community investment vehicles. And we're doing everything we can to assist our government in being successful on the fulfillment of that strategy and hopefully changing the structural inequity due to the lack of place-based and sociocultural specific investment and entrepreneurial opportunities in the country.
And seeing it from the outside, Brad, what I see, Jumpstart sits in a really interesting position because you guys are not just supporting entrepreneurs. What I like, and which is where this podcast also comes in, it sits or it operates within the gap between the system and the individual. So there must be time, and again, in your own experience, where you felt this is more than just one entrepreneur, or this is more than just a group of entrepreneurs. I feel this is more about the system and the change of system within which you're operating. So when you look at it from that lens, now we are coming into the whole entrepreneurship notion. Do you feel people are actually choosing entrepreneurship, or is it often a response to some of the limited alternatives given the socioeconomic situation we're talking about in Canada? And again, some of those things are very similar to what we have here in the UK at the moment or in Europe. So what's your take on that when it comes to jumping on the bandwagon as far as entrepreneurship is concerned?
I will ask Waseem to answer that question. Again, I'm going on and on about how I don't want to feed into credentialism, but he is the senior manager of entrepreneurship and innovation at Jumpstart Refugee Talent and surely should be out in front of this one.
Thank you, Brad. So you're right. We will find around, to be honest, 50% of our entrepreneurs are coming after frustrating from the job, finding a job or job seeking journey. And we're in the position, so Jumpstart, now it's next on June, it will be our 10th anniversary, and it will be, we will be serving more than 1,500 refugees who employed here in Canada since it started by a refugee who came here and saw that gap or the system for the job seekers. And as I mentioned, when I joined them in 2019, they saw that the problem is not only from the job placement and the job market, but also the entrepreneurship and where we need to support the entrepreneurs. Again, percent of our entrepreneurs are coming from, didn't find a job, let me try do that, or register a business and let me do that, provide the service by my own. But also we have a portion of clients who are having those kind of trades and people who have those kind of skills and ready to go to the market and provide it. But the funding or the financing, it's what holds him back to start this journey. To put it in, and to be honest, to match that with the journey, I will put Jumpstart as a similar position. When we started, again, we started with only for the job market. But when we were touching or trying to go with the entrepreneurs, when I joined them for the entrepreneurship support, I saw that gap and the challenges that I was not able to support my clients for the funding resources or where they can find work. I was standing or holding back with all of these I was not able to support them with that, to be honest. We tried different aspects. We tried to launch something called Refugee Marketplace, where we support them from the technical perspective as an e-commerce platform. So entrepreneurs or e-commerce entrepreneurs come and list their services or their products. So we took, let's say, the technical challenges for them and all of these kind of merchandising and all these kind of challenges. We tried something called Reinvest program, where we bring tech-based entrepreneurs meeting with angel investors for matching them. We tried something called Her Startup for refugee women who want to go with e-commerce and something that built from home to the market. So we work on that exactly as an entrepreneurial journey from Jumpstart. We were testing, putting those MVP and see how further we can go, who the partners could come with, either from the educational ecosystem, from the researchers, from funders and social impact funders. And you can see that the challenge of the language, the communication that I have, for example, as a senior manager, we acknowledge that we need people who have this skill to lead us and to help us also to match and bring those services to our clients. And we were fortunate to have Bradford here to support us as a first fund managers here as Jumpstart and bring these services to our clients. So this is how it works, and we acknowledge that gap, and we will seek help and to build this and change the system.
And this is such a fresh way to look at some of the support programs. Now, my question to you when it comes to looking at some of these individual programs or the projects as you talk about, I'm very intrigued in learning how would you measure, and this is a big gap at the moment, how would you measure, where do you sit and say this has been successful, and what are those metrics which you apply to understanding that this program has worked and this hasn't worked at all, and what we need to do?
We have two sides of that for Jumpstart and educational things and developing our programs and built upon, because each of those programs learned us that this is what we're missing. This is what's challenging us and a really critical point for us to bring a different program and to enhance our services to the clients. So in each of those programs, we found that's the end line. We need to change that. We need to find another solution. This is the obstacles here. So this is from the Jumpstart, and that's where the matrix of how much we're going and the support we're providing. But from our clients' perspective, it was also the business impact to their businesses, how they were satisfied of what kind of services they were looking for from Jumpstart, and the impact actually to sometimes we were supporting some of the businesses that eventually they employed, let's say, refugees themselves. So it has different impacts rather than money impact, to be honest. And we saw that in few ventures that we support them, that they become an enabler for other refugees and to be a voice for other refugees as either success story or as something to learn from their journey of how they acknowledged, how they pivot their journey, how did they react with the system.
I think that philosophy is very clear. The more I look into it, how you respond, you start with responding to a gap in the market. And now you guys are sitting at the intersection where you're trying to redesign what is there at every level, which is wonderful to see. I'll be honest with you. And again, this is not just about talking about multiple programs or adding more and more programs. I want to take you to your Refugee Impact Fund in terms of how changing how capital is introduced in the system. who is it designed to reach, who gets the benefit. So again, what is it you're actually trying to change with Refugee Impact Fund, not just in terms of the outcome, but in terms of how the capital, which can be a very complex term, I believe, but how it is structured and how it is deployed on the ground?
Yeah, I think this is absolutely fascinating to hear, kind of Waseem's explanation of the programming of the metrics and, how you prove success or identify the limitation of success and the point where it needs a bridge in order for that true outcome to be achieved in the overall economic contribution of refugee entrepreneurs in Canada. What we are really recognizing through our work in launching the Refugee Impact Fund, and to your point, Tabish, is that we're missing absolutely essential market infrastructure in order to launch a fund. So rather than just launch a fund, we've decided to build that market infrastructure simultaneously with launching a Refugee Impact Fund. So if you think of the continuum of support that is required for that longitudinal success of a refugee entrepreneur that may be participating in the programming that, Waseem has designed and allowed Jumpstart to offer to the market, then you run into the barriers to access of capital and the appropriateness of that capital and the inclination of investors in order to supply that capital. So in our strategy, we've decided that we are going to do three things. We are going to design a research platform that will actually build the evidence base, the post-secondary partnerships and empirical research methods in order to build an evidence base and a data analytics set that will allow future refugee lens investing products to be designed in a data-rich environment as opposed to a data scarcity, I would say, desert in which we were forced to try to get our funds to market with. Furthermore, that eventual investment fund, which will come to be a separately funded entity from Jumpstart Refugee Talent, the charity, needs a pipeline, and that pipeline needs to be de-risked. And although I hate speaking of the human beings of whose quality of life we were trying to improve, free market principles do have to apply here in order for us to use the system that currently exists for the results it was not designed to ensure. And a microfinance program is coming into place on top of the layers of the programming that Waseem has already designed and offers to thousands of refugee entrepreneurs, as he mentioned, in order to ensure that they have that missing middle layer of capital and of support and technical services. So that pipeline can then mature and become investable from the different debt-based and equity-focused kind of investment strategies that will focus on in the Refugee Impact Fund, which will carry a much larger ticket size and mobilize capital at scale. And then I don't want to stop there. I mean, the future just isn't going to wait for us. And that fund, as soon as, by the power invested in us, will become an experimental validation point towards institutional capital really getting the message that Refugee Lens Investing was a successful experiment that never should have had to have taken place in the first place, and that these entrepreneurs deserve to have standardized access to capital and to the opportunity to participate in Canadian venture capital markets, just like any typical entrepreneur that didn't have those sociocultural barriers or geographical barriers as well would have to face.
So for me, again, looking from the outside, in terms of how fantastic this program is, but again, I've got certain elements which I need to tease out here, because there are strands here which you've left for us in terms of what are we looking at? Are we looking at it, again, when you frame it, when you explain it, when you define it, are we talking about building access for entrepreneurs? And again, this would be helpful for those who are listening, not necessarily coming from, the finance background or looking at it that way, but is it about building access for entrepreneurs, or is it about confidence for the investors? And my final bit to this would be, again, are we trying to create something new, a new wheel altogether, or are we trying to formalize something that has already existed informally, which takes us back to those communities, the groups of individuals who have been on this journey for a very long time and have been working out informal solutions.
Waseem, if you'll humor me if I continue on in my passionate, I hope it's not a rant, so to speak. I'd like to answer that with a bit of a philosophical note, and then we will certainly, become technical and structured, as appropriate. All we're really setting out to do here is prove that of which is obvious and has existed for hundreds of years, is that these people, these communities are resilient, they are hardworking, they build community, they build economy, they build institutions, they build businesses, and they deserve access to capital, and that is how economies flourish. And that is all the Refugee Lens Investing experiment will succeed in the Canadian context is proving that of which already exists. However, it has to do that within in a system that is engineered to deny that very existence. A system that is engineered in order to dehumanize, disenfranchise, dislocate, and at the end of the day, dismantle entrepreneurship and innovation. With creating indisputable data sets, with having the will of the institutions behind the success of the fund, to your point, Tabish, earlier, it is both simultaneously about providing access to capital for entrepreneurs while simultaneously proving that of which is obvious, that this is a segment of the population that will return capital with productivity, with innovation, and eventually with harmony. Now, that being said, we have different stakeholder groups that have to get the message in order for this to come into play. And we have the complex, and dare I say at times daunting, responsibility to really figure out how to communicate effectively with all of these different stakeholder groups at once in order to make this point to society writ large. And that does get complicated, convoluted, as well as in need of stiff, drunk scotch sometimes at the end of the week in order to come back refreshed and take this task on. But in summary, I would like to say Refugee Lens Investing approach that the Canadian impact investing ecosystem is adopting through Jumpstart Refugee Talent is really the roundabout, and it is the roundabout necessity and responsibility and the raison d'etre of this offshoot of the Canadian Social Finance Fund to change market behavior, to change investment behavior, and to change systems that stifle this kind of inclusivity and economic.
So, coming back to you, Waseem, in terms of what we just heard, do you feel, again, on the ground with your boots on the ground and, what you're doing at the moment, is it shifting expectation? Is it creating some sort of momentum, or do you still feel there's a long way to go? And this is where your vision comes in terms of what you're doing with Jumpstart.
That's for me.
Yes, Waseem, sorry, yes.
Yeah. Absolutely. I can see that there is a change in everything we're doing, and in every when we did also, or we are conducting the market research and building all the evidence needed for how Bradford perfectly mentioned it and built it there. While we were doing that, we saw the interaction and the change and the willing of those stakeholders of seeing these changes and understanding those changes and looking forward to be part of that changes. And we took that really unique and great opportunity of getting Jumpstart approach and management and creativity innovative way and social impact fund and great partners who were willing and trust that about that vision, and having the best domain experts like Bradford to help us to craft this programs and structure. This unique success factors bring this to life. And as Bradford mentioned, this will not only change the narrative, this will put a great impact on those communities and individuals and families. And that's what I'm visioning. And this is based on my personal, let's say, suffering and journey and dream, to be honest. Once we start that with the first other cohort and with the first success story, that will change everything there. They will show that how these kind of small things or adapting certain changes in the system will have that impact, a huge impact in the economic and in the social sector.
And for me, listening to you both, what I feel, you have turned a simple word of support and you've turned it to something structural, which we don't hear in these realms or on these pathways, which is wonderful, which is why I want to sit a bit more with our 3-layer system, because I don't see it as a single intervention. Again, this is not about one fund, one program, or one idea. It is designed as a system. Again, you've described this as those 3-layer approach, starting with the ecosystem, the data, then again moving into the early stage capital, and then into a very structured set of investment. And I think this is where your work is very, very important and very interesting at the same time. So, how about we walk through that architecture a bit more in detail? We have to make sure that we look at it from a practice point of view as well. So again, as experts looking into it, what are those three layers? How does it work, and how does it connect in practice?
I think the three layers are already reasonably explained, and certainly, Tabish, by your recollection, of those points and how the structure kind of continually flows in a circular replenishing and recycling of capital, resources, creativity, innovation, and longitudinally not only improves the quality of life of refugees, of all dependence of the Canadian economy, and with the enrichment of data and with the enrichment of an evidence base and with the launching of successive products of a refugee lens investing approach in Canada, we can only kind of look forward to this enhancement of the system with great enthusiasm. I think one of the things that needs to be called out here as to why this level of planning has been possible, is intentional, and is currently underway, is the environment in which we set out to do it. And structurally, I think while we are talking about systems failure that is occurring in Canada, and we are acknowledging inequitable systems based on legacy design, I don't want to come across as being cynical towards the country and its ability to find its way out of it, because we live in an incredible country with incredible resources, programming, and that of which should be aspirational in terms of our adherence to human rights, equity, and our ability to be innovative and change course when we find ourselves walking off a cliff or backing ourselves into a corner. If you look at the Refugee Lens Investing Canada platform, the evidence-based community of practice, collaboration between post-secondary institutions, international think tanks, practitioner organizations, that is going to set the curriculum and the research methods that will come to ensure that refugee lens investing exists in a data-rich environment in Canada. We didn't create that through Jumpstart Refugee Talent ourselves. The Canadian government has been absolutely prioritizing a focus on global migration, of cultural integration, of entrepreneurship and innovation, and ensuring that diversity, equity, inclusion, geographical adherence, First Nations, Aboriginal practices, truth and reconciliation, our very kind of fiber of the community that is Canada at large is an absolute requirement in terms of program design, allocation of capital, policy making at the senior level. So it's all kind of coming together. And then when Jumpstart Refugee Talent, this scrappy, innovative, refugee-led charity celebrating its 10-year anniversary, has been able to approach these institutional partners for institutional backing and multi-year collaboration and funding agreements, the response has been, we've been ready for you for years. Where have you been? And here it is. When you look at the programming and the microfinance element of what we're setting out to do, the Canadian social finance ecosystem and the incubators that we have across the country and the funding that has come down from groups like ESDC or FedDev Canada, ISED, they have absolutely prioritized these groups. When you look at the granting behavior of our foundations, just demanding innovation and social entrepreneurship from our settlement agencies, from our workforce development and placement agencies, focusing on newcomer services, it is an absolutely coordinated effort on behalf of all aspects of the Canadian society and economy working within an imperfect system. There is an army trying to change it right now. And then you have the Canadian Impact Investing Group that have been absolute trailblazers in advocating in Ottawa, in building funds through Toronto, in focusing on getting ESG and impact vehicles launched on the Toronto Stock Exchange, on consulting with charitable organizations, the different co-ops and structures, credit unions, where you can place capital into programs that can prioritize these groups because they have more lenient legal and fiduciary arrangements that allow them to really prioritize that form of capital as a method towards inclusivity. And then you have, not to be arrogant, but consultants like myself for the last 20 years have been trying to figure out how do we create the platform, the language sets, the multidisciplinary nomenclature to really allow this voice and this movement to communicate and implement change at a coherent and executable kind of vector. And that's where we are right now. And I'm very, very proud to say Jumpstart is in that group of people. And Jumpstart will introduce refugee lens investing into a mainstream impact focus of the Canadian market to see it then be taken up by institutional investors. And refugee economic exclusion from capital markets will be a thing of the past.
I think that's a very bold vision, Brad, I'll say. And obviously, like I said earlier, the intent is there. And you gave us a full overview of the ecosystem and the full crowd which is getting onto this. But let me play a bit of a devil's advocate here. I've got a few questions. Yeah, where we look into, obviously you'll be transitioning into large scale, structured capital through the investment vehicle. But looking at all those three layers, the research, the ecosystem, and again, the microfinance, if one of those layers didn't exist or, malfunctioned or wasn't adequately supported or worked out, according to you, what would break in that system? What would happen? What would be the eventuality?
Yeah, I think that there's pain points in, all of the layers that we're speaking on right now. I think that by far the most vulnerable kind of capacity building and inclusivity intentioned activity, in this kind of value chain that we're talking about is the entrepreneurship. You said something really interesting earlier on. Are people kind of being forced into entrepreneurship, due to lack of participation in more linear paths to the Canadian economy. And I think that is absolutely true. And as mentioned before, the microfinance side of this will be a debt-based product, and it will be very patient in terms of the terms that it offers to folks. It is not out to make a profit. It is there to be a supportive service and to create a pipeline as to where more traditional capital markets can start to nurture this cohort of opportunity. So with that, it is very important that ownership takes priority over growth in this whole system. That what we are really focusing on is the transfer of ownership, and by that, agency, leverage, collateral, and self-determination. So are we looking to build an army of deep tech growth-oriented refugee-led companies? No. What we're looking to do is to create an ecosystem where refugee entrepreneurs that, to your point, by necessity, much of the time, are looking at entrepreneurship as the appropriate vector to economic inclusion in in Canada, are met with capital that is given on term, that is appropriate to their specific reality, their need, their timeline, their level or lack of modes of production, and really ensuring that it has community focused, that there are structures in place such as cooperative models, such as pooled funds, such as funds that will only invest with an asset investment thesis with asset-based community development in mind. And at the end of the day, we're building community, we're building livelihoods, we're building economic inclusion. We are not looking in certain cases for market rate returns, because that in itself right there are the two weakest links in the chains. Market rate returns at all costs and entrepreneurship without a rational and limiting view of when that kind of approach to creating livelihood is really effective for our clients.
Yeah, I think, like I said, this is very transformational, and I'm very lucky to have both of you here, where obviously we have this vision, we have this process, we have this system. So coming to you, Waseem, what we just heard from Brad in terms of this closing the gap, and again, are we trying to meet somewhere in the middle? How do you see this working on a long-term basis? And where do you see it taking us in terms of this space?
Perfect. So the structure that what we're bringing here is based on, again, learning path, a long learning path coming from other refugee or similar Jumpstart or similar, let's say, organizations that try their best either from the programming or from the funding perspective. And what we were trying here is to balance between that risk mitigation and the impact, building the impact. Again, we're trying our best to bring that to balance that. But in any case, we are seeing that this will change the way that the system is working. For sure. Either if if there was any mistake in that, we'll try to fix in future while we're implementing this and implementing the strategy here, or by succeeding with most of it. And this would be provided, especially when we are putting that platform of the researchers and learners, that would be available for any of those, or any participant in the ecosystem and stakeholders to enhance service, to adopt, to change, to understand and learn, either from the pillars or success milestones there in the program. And we're going in very detailed, let's say, pathways of how to implement those strategies. And we're bringing the experts here in each of those aspects, either from the researchers or from the financial sectors or from the programming itself. So we're including the whole, let's say, holistic, let's say, review to build this and to implement. And we will go with that is step by step to keep monitoring this balance between the risk and the impact.
I am so glad you mentioned about risk, which is exactly where I was going with this as well, because we cannot, and again, I apologize for my ignorance, but we cannot talk about impact investing without talking about risk. And again, you have mentioned about de-risking people. Again, this is where we explore a bit about the language of risk, because it comes up so often when we're talking about entrepreneurship and we're talking about investment in finance. But as far as I'm concerned, risk is not neutral. It is about perception, it's about familiarity, and often what systems we are used to seeing in and around us. When we talk about de-risking in this context, are we actually de-risking the business, or are we talking about how investors look at it? If that makes sense, my question.
Is it a Waseem question or a Bradford?
Either of you. We are coming to a point where it is very well explained that way by both of you. So either of you can take it.
Thank you, my friend. Well, risk exists everywhere. Risk is ubiquitous. Risk, follows us around every step of every minute of every day. So I can really kind of pick and choose what area of risk we want to focus on right now. I think there are, and it's worthy to focus on many. With the Refugee Impact Fund, again, which is an $8 to $15 million debt-based investment fund, focusing on kind of two main categories of what we call the refugee lend investing taxonomy. These are either refugee founded businesses or refugee supporting businesses, or what we call infrastructure organizations, service delivery or entrepreneurship support services organizations that are attractive from a lending perspective, that can absorb the specific kind of products that we would design, impact-based, milestone-based, program-related investments, things of that nature. And their, key kind of service delivery is really demonstrably improving the outcomes of refugees in Canada. So when you kind of look at those three groups loosely associated, you start to define the impact thesis of investing in refugee lens investing through those three segments for the fund. And when you look at risk, each of those kind of segments of the portfolio carry different risk profiles. And with that, also become either more or less mission aligned the more you start to really conduct your due diligence on those different entities and on those different investment opportunities. And given that it is a fund that does return capital to the Canadian social finance investment ecosystem at market rate returns, it has to be diligent in the investments that it makes and the performance management structure of the fund. So with that being said, we de-risk through feasibility analysis, but with that prioritization to achieving a certain degree of feasibility, we sometimes do have to sacrifice a certain degree of mission alignment. And it's just the harsh reality in terms of, again, working in a system that was not designed for this level of impact and this level of equity through a financial mechanism of this nature. So if you look at our portfolio, you have what we call, and by the way, we hate referring to our fellow human beings in attributes, but we do, in order to make sense to capital allocators, have to explain this. And the levels are an R1 or an R2 or an R3, a kind of a profile. And then with each category comes a little bit less mission alignment. They become a little bit more feasible, a little bit more sensible from a finance perspective, but they become a little less aligned from truly getting the capital into the hands of the refugee entrepreneurs that face the greatest barriers or are really aligned within their communities to catalyze the kind of impact that we're looking for. But that being said, we do de-risk based on portfolio analysis feasibility analysis, and by definition, by allowing the definition to loosen so we can actually make a financial product work.
Sorry, I will add from the risk perspective here also, I would see this kind of where we spoke about the balancing between the risk and the impact and the mission as Bradford mentioned there. I see also the risk of the failure of this kind of the fund itself or the program also. That will have a huge impact on the also any future enhancement or change on the system. This is why we need to carefully understand this kind of risk for each of those pillars or pathways and the needs, how each of the stakeholders or let's say stakeholders are seeing these risks from their perspective and understand it and putting that in the right way.
I think you've answered my question that way, where I wanted to ask about, how assumption based this is, or in terms of how grounded it is in data. And clearly, I can see the thread there. But one question which I have to ask here is, when we're talking about this, are we talking about, is there a distinction between the actual performance and the unfamiliarity? How would you align the risk or the de-risk bit to the unfamiliarity or the actual performance of this? Because it takes us back to where the risk originate, who's assuming it, and again, how is it being perceived? So the question is, how do you link it to the actual performance and what you have to show for it?
Forgive me to wax philosophical on you again for a brief moment.
I love that. No problem
Before
at all.
getting technical, I promise, gentlemen. Look, the people that take the biggest risks are the refugees themselves and the newcomers to Canada. All the risks that we talk about assuming in a financial product or risk inherent in our impact measurement frameworks in our programming is nascent compared to the risk of uprooting your entire life in order to put faith that you are going to be welcomed and given a fair opportunity to participate and to build a country as was promised to you, as is the universal right of any human being in this world. They are the biggest risk takers, and that is really the only risk that truly matters at the end of the day in this product. Now, to get a little bit more technical, as mentioned, we mitigate risk across the financial portfolio and the impact investing ecosystem that make up our LPs and our donors that allow this kind of work to continue are very familiar with the fact that we are all charting an ambiguous and undetermined path together. So as long as they can see the sound management of resources, the return of capital at the agreed terms, as well as, impact measurement that adheres to the best practices in Canada. And again, to tip my hat to the Canadian Social Finance Fund, that was well developed. So there's a group called the Common Approach in Canada who was well funded throughout this entire strategy to come up with kind of the Canadian interpretation of all the different indices, the SDGs, the big society capital metrics for impact investing, and really say this is what's most relevant to our country. In our particular project, the Refugee Lens Investing taxonomy, which we inherit from our friends in the Refugee Investment Network out of Washington. Thank you, Tim. Thank you. Come with a framework that we adhere to in order to report to our stakeholders that we are staying within the range of that taxonomy. And that taxonomy is internationally vetted and more and more becoming the standard for this kind of investing. So we do the best we can in order to communicate and be transparent around the ambiguous at times risk in charting consistency and standardization and what would become regulation in terms of, hoping to establish refugee lens investing in Canada. But it is, at the end of the day, you are working within a system that was not designed, to necessarily guide you along your paths.
And I would add that, especially that perfectly said from the system perspective of how the dealing the risk. I was usually facing those kind of challenges of transferring or showing those risks to our entrepreneurs and who came to Canada to understand those risks, because our risk is their risk, to be honest. So our risk is depending on how risky they are and how they are managing these risks. And this is where mainly our focusing would be from the program being perspective, other than the funding itself, of understanding and managing those kind of their business, how to build it and how to mitigate their own risks, which will impact our or risk, to be honest.
Again, very well defined there, because when we look at the definition of risk itself, again, we're talking about who gets the access and who doesn't, which then please be the guide for me for this one, because this is a big question which brings everything together in terms of what we have spoken so far, in terms of the redesigning. Again, you guys are an expert at what you're trying to do. But when we talk about the investment, when we talk about the challenges, those intersections which we have already discussed, we cannot not talk about the market, because again, market as the normal economic definition would be how it responds to signal, the data and the performance. But what you both are talking to me here is clearly they recognize a certain form of value. And again, they do it in a way which includes certain group and then excludes or overlooks other. So my question again, this one, please, like I said, please be my guide here. Do you genuinely believe that the market can be designed to be a bit more inclusive? And I add the word bit a bit more intentionally here, because the size of the challenge in front of us is absolutely huge. Or do you think markets are structurally selective by nature?
Waseem,
I'll start with Waseem, because Waseem has been on the ground.
Perfect. I would say that absolutely the market, it's the benefits and how they could see the benefits there from those individuals and communities. And if we enable those individuals and communities to be really have their potential capabilities and power into the market and the economy in general, absolutely, the market will adopt that. There is no, let's say, everything you hear from all these opposing things with the politics and media and everything, that's coming from narratives and those kind of stories, and where they want to highlight it for their own certain group interests. But in general, when you go to any personal, let's say, or any regular person or organization in the market or buyer, they will not have that much. They will see that the impact and the value that those individuals and communities are bringing. And this is where we're trying to help here and support, to show those values, and where there is a potential that give them the chance to come forward and to implement it to the market.
Would you add anything on that, Brad?
I think it's an absolutely fascinating question. And I agree with Waseem's optimism and the humanism inherent with the mass market. And that's what the market truly is. In its intent, organic behavior will not accept the exclusion of the unlocked capacity, productivity, creativity of the segments of the economy, the people that we're talking about. With that being said, I think we have a daunting structural obstacle to overcome, where wealth and privilege and capital, governance, decision-making is being channeled into the hands of the absolute few, the extremely elite. And human behavior has to prove, even if it comes down to a near revolutionary degree of reaction and speaking out against disenfranchisement, that this will correct itself somehow. That the extraction from community, that the adherence to shareholder value, that the need for division at the expense of community and small, medium enterprise being the backbone of a country, local community, and economy, it simply cannot continue in perpetuity. It's insustainable. And I would like to have faith that those people that do have the ability to start to truly correct the course will do so, because humanity deserves our optimism. But with that being said, one way or the other, impact investing, refugee lens investing, and all of the goodwill that is emerging and growing and is going to at some point either turn the tide by force or simply by example, simply will not be denied. And we will see a more equitable distribution of wealth in the lifetimes of our kids and their kids and future generations to come.
And I think you are walking the talk, as it seems, with what you are doing in Canada. And it is very important that I give my audience some important takeaway when we are talking about it, because this is such a huge question, Brad and Waseem. So, and I cannot speak on behalf of others, but I can certainly ask you what you're trying to do. So if you have to tell me, is it something you're trying to reform within existing systems, or you're trying to build a parallel one, which is where the distribution of power happens when we're talking about things like that? So where would you stand on this with your organization? So I'll put Waseem on a difficult spot, and then I will come to you, Brad.
I thought that question had Waseem all over it.
Great.
Thank you for pointing that out, Tabish.
To be honest, is that how understanding and how to enable or to bring this kind of really tailored support that each of those individuals will need. And this is a challenge of how to build that, the capacity and the resources needed to do so. And allocating these resources for organizations and organizations who are involved in this. This is the huge challenge, to be honest. And this is the main barriers for this, where the NGOs in general, or also any players in this ecosystem are facing tremendous, let's say, resource challenging and capacity building challenges. And also that implement to officers or people who are doing this job and the pressure that they are under to deliver those kind of services and support.
Yeah. I mean, this is a big debate in terms of having an alternative pathway, or we are good enough in terms. I remember you described yourself. Again, thinking more in terms of the activism space. So are we trying to reform an existing system, or are we trying to build something completely new?
Yeah, it's really neat to think that, are we part of capitalism 2.0, or are we, trying to build something from the ground up? Wouldn't be so arrogant as to pretend I hold all the answers on this one. But, with that being said, a couple of things. As mentioned earlier, I do look at impact investing as an approach as opposed to a asset class or a market within a market. Mm-hmm. I think we play within established markets and systems, and I think we build a multidisciplinary approach. That market or that system and the exclusionary elements, the governance, just didn't plan for. But I don't look at that completely cynically either. I think that the only way that the system also kind of uprights the ship or course corrects is to acknowledge that it is enabled to do so without, and I kind of keep coming back to the same place, without the more equal distribution of wealth and agency, diversity, global migration. There is only one way that GDP per capita in Canada resets the consumer price index to an appropriate level. And that has to do with economic agency of a population with a strong middle class, with the ability to have families or whatever they choose without being burdened and being forced into serfdom or indentured servitude at the behest of a growing attention to corporate infrastructure and shareholder value. So are we trying to change the system, Tabish, or are we simply trying to refresh it by saying, hey, system, you need to let go of your established norms. You need to let go of thinking you were built for the benefit of the few. You need to let go of the indoctrined behavior that recognize that human beings as a unit of economic efficiency only fit into the category that you could continually extract and reduce into, be it affordable and cheap labor markets at the sheer pursuit of profit margins and shareholder returns and, quarterly earnings reports. I'm sorry, system. You had a good run for the redistribution of equity, which then will result in the accumulation of wealth, which will result in the minimization of the potential for extraction, which will result in a unified identity and harmony within the Canadian population. But there's really only one way this goes, one way or the other. Pick the easy path, pick the hard path. Let's get down to work.
I think that's very well put, Brad. I think, and my last question before we head into the quick fire round, and I will give this to Waseem, if you don't mind. My question is here, in 10 years' time, and again, looking forward to that vision, what would you want to see differently in the journey of entrepreneurs you work with based on what you're doing right now, what you've done in the past, and where do you see that change happening differently to these entrepreneurs?
That's a great question. Actually, I don't want to wait till 10 years. I can see this in the next couple of years that entrepreneurs, refugee entrepreneurs, newcomers entrepreneurs will know exactly this is how those kind of the pathways that I have, options that I have. There is no changes if I have the abilities, the dream, and all the success factors that needed to, as a Canadian born entrepreneurs, have the same equal abilities and factors. I have the right, or I know what to do and where to get the support there. There is no barriers because that's discrimination there in the system. And I think that Canadians in their nature and the polite nature that they have as they talk to system and engage with the system will have that in less than 10 years for sure.
Brilliant. I think I love the simplicity in that vision of yours, Waseem, which then takes us to the final quick fire round. So what I will expect from both of you, without putting you on spot, one word or a small response to what I'm about to ask. Again, very simple, but again, as experts, it gives some thought to this. One word for the broad notion of entrepreneurship we talk about. What does it stand for you, Waseem?
For entrepreneurs?
Yeah, entrepreneurship as a process of people, entrepreneurs. What does it stand for you?
Innovative and resilience, to be honest.
Innovation and resilience. Yeah, I'll take that. Brad, what does it mean to you?
Deserved ownership through creativity towards agency.
Okay, and then the next one coming to you, Brad, first. Capital or community?
One should not exist without the other.
What about you, Waseem?
I think that, a combination or the best tailored things for refugees entrepreneurs.
Okay. And again, sticking to you, Waseem, the biggest myth about refugee entrepreneurship. I'm sorry, I'm not offering any prize whatsoever.
A lot, man. This is a huge thing. A lot of those combined things that came with the refugees, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
The sort of skill, the unfortunate that what they usually combine to refugees.
Would you take that, Brad?
Sector specificity. So I think for whatever reason, there's a stigma that, refugee entrepreneurs kind of all just immediately almost defer to setting up businesses in line with their specific food and culture, music, really something that they're trying to carry over. It couldn't be further from the case. Well, some of that does exist. I mean, the amount you find in deep tech and advanced health services and advanced manufacturing, and it'll just blow your mind in terms of, again, like any segment of the population, the diversity, creativity, ingenuity, and the scope of what you find.
Yeah, brilliant. My last question before I shut up, I promise. One last thing which investors misunderstand.
Wow. I'll try, but I might need to ramble on for a minute. You notice you stumped us both with that one. Okay, my answer is everything.
Okay, so there's a lot of misunderstanding going around in that space. Would you agree with that?
Elaborate really quickly. I hope the humor came across. It is incredible how specific, prudent, tight, data rigid the due diligence processes of your typical venture or institutional investor have evolved to become over the course of our market experience. They, to your point on risk, will not let a speck of it in if they can help it. And their governance has evolved over centuries at this point in order to ensure that that's the case. Trying to adjust investor behavior writ large is an incredibly daunting conversation to be part of. And it's one in Canada that is taking the entire Canadian impact investing ecosystem to do right now. So I would report that while we were working on the refugee lens investing as a subsegment of this Canadian impact investing ecosystem, the community is incredibly tight-knit and is always engaging in activism and capacity building at the end of the day, trying to get our major financial institutions to launch impact portfolios to truly bring this kind of thematic investing into the mainstream. And that is going to take decades in order to truly find that common ground.
Waseem, any final word on that?
I would say the hidden potentials coming from those entrepreneurs, refugee entrepreneurs, especially when we're looking to all these changes, global changes that's coming with political and economic point of view for Canada and the state, and all of these kind of restructuring things here. and how missing potential we are having here if we are not using this kind of huge diversity, huge potential, different culture and origins of those entrepreneurs to affect more globally for Canadian system and Canadian culture and economy.
Brilliant, brilliant. Thank you so much for that. Before I close, I was just wondering, I promise no more questions, but I was just wondering if you want to give a shout out to any of your partners, any of your programs, any of your system, any of your processes that, which you'd want people to go find out about or know about. You can.
Waseem, would you care to?
I'll start with
You start on behalf of Jumpstart. I'll kind of chime in on behalf of the fund. And
okay, yeah,
for sure, I have that for Bradford and for coming with his great experience and knowledge to Jumpstart. I'll start also with the Jumpstart co-founders and management, which they really believe and enable this kind of innovation way, giving this space of trying things and challenging whatever we are having there in the system, and plus the team, the senior management, the employees, the stakeholders keep listening and acting and testing and failing and succeeding. This kind of really, I've never seen this in other NGOs or even in any for-profit organizations as well. So I would say that loudly to Mustafa Elio, our co-founder, to Malaz Sibai, to all the board of directors there, the change makers. And you can see that Mustafa Elio is now in all the political aspects in the United Nations, in Geneva. He's vocal and outspoken about these kind of changes that needed, not only on the economic side, in the political side, in the humanitarian side, in the narrative side. So shout out and thank you for Brad to joining us in this and giving that believe in this and give all what he can to Refugee Impact Fund.
Thank you for sharing that, Brad. Do you want to have a final word on that?
Thank you, Waseem. Thank you, Tabish. I just want to reiterate what an honor it is to be part of this work. How grateful I am to be involved in the Canadian impact investing ecosystem and connecting Jumpstart refugee talent to the movement that is redistributing equitable participation in our economy through our financial markets. In particular, we'd like to thank the Definity Foundation, World Education Services, Realize Capital Partners, all the folks at the Canadian social finance ecosystem and strategy, SDC Canada, the federal government that have made this possible. We would like to thank the North Pine Foundation for taking Jumpstart to the SOCAP conference in 2022. That's where my firm, The Sector, met the team at Jumpstart, and we started to understand that Waseem and his team had this vision for quite some time in terms of bringing this level of innovation and systems change into the investment landscape of Canada and addressing those limitations. I'm humbled. I'm grateful. I would also say thank you so much to our team at Jumpstart Refugee Talent. We just work with the most incredible bunch of impassioned individuals. The organization is refugee-led, it's refugee-founded, it is refugee-designed, and it is truly an inspiration and one of the organizations that is going to be absolutely fundamental in, the tide of an inequitable system. And thank you, Tabish, to you for taking the time to allow us to, exude the pride and humility and the dedication that we have to working, with these folks for the folks that we're here to work for.
A huge thank you to both of you, Bradford and Waseem. An absolute honor. I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. And again, a lot of things I can talk about, but there are a few things which I can clearly say to my audience, in terms of when you're looking in this space, when you're talking about these things, you're not talking about shortage of entrepreneurs, you're not talking about shortage of ideas. What we have here is a system which actually decides there are certain groups who are recognized and there are certain who are ignored. And what you two are building and what Jumpstart is actually doing, again, from different ends. We're not talking about support. We have discussed that over a period of time now. It's about the pathway, from exclusion to recognition to investment. That's a fantastic layer. And it's a very different kind of system. So this has been Builders of the Broken Bazaar. I am Dr. Tabish. Up until next time, please keep questioning, keep building, even when the system doesn't see it yet. Thank you so much for listening.